As a single man in my early 30s, I have a very different life from my brother, who is 29 and has 4 children already. He started his family at 22, and his wife gave birth to another one every year or two. The youngest one is only a few months old. I can't stand his wife, who always acts like she is better than me, and provokes me with her snide remarks. If I ever fought back, she would turn into a crying mess and play the victim. She is very good at manipulating people and getting their sympathy. My parents and brother love her to death, even though they are well aware of her true nature. She is very attractive, I admit, but her personality is so horrible that I could never feel any attraction to her. She also refuses to work, even though she has a college degree, and my mother helps her with the kids all day. They rely entirely on my brother's income, which means they have to live with my parents. They have no privacy in the small 3-bedroom house that was built in the 60s. My brother was always the golden child growing up. He is 3 years younger than me, but he acted like he was superior to me because I was always punished harshly if I responded to his mischief in any way. It was clear that my parents favored him over me because he got most of the attention and resources unless someone else pointed out the unfairness. That happened quite often to other family members, which is why my parents decided to move us away from them, about 150 miles away. They only saw them on holidays, since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother was physically abusive to me several times. He flirted with my first girlfriend until she dumped me, and he mocked me whenever I had any trouble. My parents told me to just deal with it whenever I complained. They only treated me equally when they had to put on a show for others. I remember how funny it was to see their faces when they had to give me the same gifts as my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were watching. We had relatives who were very curious and loved to spread drama. So, my parents tried their best to hide the truth and threatened to take away everything I had if I ever spoke up. It only made them happier when I moved out at 18 because they didn't have to support me anymore. I was still in high school when I left, but living on friends' couches was much better than living with them. I barely kept in touch with them after that. They didn't even bother to come to my high school graduation, but I didn't care. Since then, I only saw my parents and brother on holidays, like the rest of the family. The pandemic that started in 2020 hit me hard. I lost my job and had to leave the condo I was renting with my roommate, who also lost his job. We couldn't afford the place with the unemployment money. It was a 2-bedroom condo that I liked. My roommate moved out early to stay with his relatives, and I had to sell most of my stuff because I was facing homelessness. If I didn't reduce my belongings drastically, I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place. But I enjoyed living the high life, until that life turned against me, and I realized I should have lived somewhere cheaper and saved more money for emergencies. But I had a plan. I had a truck that I loved, so I bought a $1,000 camper in good condition and put it on my truck so I could live in it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it much longer than I expected. I hoped to park the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family also lived. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they said they had no room for me, and they didn't want me there. We had a bad relationship for the last decade. They said they would only let me park my camper there if I paid them the same amount as renting an apartment in my area. That was too much for just parking my camper. I had no job, and I was trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I found a new job. I might as well live in an apartment with that rent price they wanted. My parents called my camper ugly and told me to get lost since we couldn't agree. And Seal thought it was very funny that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in laughing at me and calling me a homeless loser. I parked my truck in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night that I had nowhere else to go. I was terrified that someone might break in. I didn't sleep well that night. I had no other options, as all my other relatives who owned houses were too far away, and all my friends lived in apartments, and I was attached to my area. I didn't want to leave. I also had my mail sent to a friend's apartment. It was the only way I could get my mail anymore. Finding a stable place to park was very hard. I looked around for a job similar to my old one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. At that time, I had to deal with a lot. Everything from beggars and drug addicts to people telling me to leave because my camper was an eyesore. Once someone who told me to move said they were with an HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses. And when I asked what HOA, they got very angry and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway to avoid trouble. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a bad thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator. And generators are loud and need fuel anyway, so I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally got a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while in college and promised myself never again, though I was almost ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had nowhere to live while getting it, and I didn't want to be out of a job when it ended. Plus, I was bored to death. I had nothing much to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and what local public bathrooms I could use. I wish we had public bathhouses like the Japanese do. We could use something like that here. When I finally got a new job, I practically lived in the backlot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces that no one else seemed to use because they were so far in the back that the area was almost forgotten. My boss, company owner, liked this arrangement because I was willing to take any shift I could get as long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm unsure if this was legal, but no one bothered us. The whole time I lived back there, I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards kicked them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me, and I was working almost every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office but the janitor and security guard. Besides that, I usually had to shower at a friend's apartment, or my local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower and only a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a gross chore. So I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with the night security guard. He's since become one of my best friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater. Summers were not fun though. The camper didn't have AC, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it tolerable. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned some new skills from other employees. Eventually, halfway into this year, I got a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The fear I'd gotten from losing my condo made me realize I needed something more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work, and just 2 miles away, I found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property, but I managed to get it for $10K less than the asking price somehow. I used almost all of my savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off to set it up in the backyard. So I put it there as a little building just in case I want to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I was stupid enough to brag about it in my book of faces. My family saw the post, and that's where this shit starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit without warning to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address. So how they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends have admitted it, and no previous family members visited me before that. So I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It wouldn't shock me. Once I opened the door, they practically all pushed their way in like rowdy tourists, then just started making themselves at home. They all kept snooping around, and SIL had this creepy smirk that she was constantly flashing me. And it was only later that I understood why. And it made me angrier than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were always talking about how I have so much extra space now, and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. And my brother kept saying how there was more space than our parents' house. And my house was closer to his job too. Red flags everywhere, I know. Eventually, my brother asked me to talk privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and went out to the front porch. That's what finally made me realize they had something planned. My brother said the house was too much for me alone, and I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid number 4, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they live in the main house. And I'd like to point out that Dan never once mentioned offering rent. Mind you, he's got a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it wasn't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had gone crazy. But Dan went nuts long ago thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house, or parts of my house, to him. Other people maybe, just so I can pay the mortgage off more easily, but not him or his nasty wife. I've seen this exact kind of situation in videos online many times, and never once did I think I'd live it because I thought it was so ridiculous. But my parents, brother, and SIL do all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic, entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone and set it to start recording, then just held on to it. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this and just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house, then went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "Hell no." And I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I stood up and then told him that my house was not up for grabs. And acting like I'll let him move in just because they want it won't make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total bullshit because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course, I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and I don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this, and that I would. I yelled, as if their word was law or something, and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then right on cue, my parents and SEL barged back in through the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of arguing, but to sum it up from this point on, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," way more times than I can count. In the fight, I told them all they had no say in my life or my house, and to get out before I called the cops. Sil shouted the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again, and I couldn't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just thought she could take and take from me like I would just let it happen. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a snooty bitch who never had any respect for me, so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept telling him to let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be, and to not come back. Then I told SEL that my phone recorded everything, and if she tried anything, I'd press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out loudly, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said that I better do this for Dan and Sil. I responded by telling her I won't be. Part 2. After I kicked my parents, brother, and SIL out for trying to make me give up my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago, and I put my profile on private. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home was trying to twist the event to make me the bad guy, and I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before them, and I had video evidence to back up my story about what they'd done. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and CL must have been ready to write their post, but it was too late. So, they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan, and CL had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were. So, what happened was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular that called me. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me that I was a terrible brother and that I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't repeat. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch. Just like they said they would in their previous ultimatum, they rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a bit, and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down, and then, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them, and never came back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I couldn't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said I do not love him as a brother because he abused me for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. Then told them to leave, or I'd be calling the police as soon as possible. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family there moving stuff in. He just flashed me when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop, but Esiel smugly said to me that, like it or not, they were moving in. And then in the most fake way, while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I seethed with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug, bitchy face, so locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, Sil started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, and that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. And she cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I said to him, "This is my house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told Sil if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan and Sil, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told cops what had happened, as well as showed them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then when we went to my front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock. The old lock was lying on the porch with the center of it drilled out, and the drill they used was lying next to it, with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown on all the events that happened before. I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I got home, because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. So, Dan and Esiel finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They'd drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out, and I don't think going to jail and court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only way of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call CPS too for good measure. Dan went white and looked scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house to himself instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now, or I'll press charges. I stated in a shout about how they drilled out my front door lock to break in, the lease papers were obvious fakes, they badly forged my signature, and I have recorded video of Sil attacking me. These are the crimes with which I could destroy their lives if I chose to, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids. This means they only have one chance to avoid jail. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan, My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to Sil and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. Sil instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his room now. Sil and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. I swear, I think they'd practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Sil kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. The kids and Sil were wailing like crazy, and Dan shouted at me, "Are you happy now? You've ruined our chance of having a home because you're too greedy to share and help out family." I burst out laughing and snapped back that what he was doing was stealing, not sharing, and no number of tears will make me let his family move in because he's not my brother anymore. He's just a spoiled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, like when we were kids. Dan started dropping F-bombs on me until the cops told him to calm down, or he'd be in cuffs, regardless if I wanted to press charges. He pursed his lips and looked a mix of scared and furious. I asked the cops if they could stay until my parents, brother, and Sil had all gone, and they said they wouldn't leave until this was settled. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more arrived for some reason. That made my parents hurry up a bit. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door. He was hesitant to give them up. Then instead of giving them to me, he threw them down the street and into a storm drain, while saying to go get them myself. But one of the cops reprimanded him for that, and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to reach them, and he got pretty filthy in the process. When he got the keys back, he just muttered, then slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to get out and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this as if that mattered to me, and I told them that. Then, in a very sarcastic way, I said something like, "Oh no, that means I won't get to join any holidays with you guys where I always get treated like crap by you all anyway, because Dan has always been your clear favorite. You treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do what you always told me to do when I was abused by all of you, and suck it up." My parents were stunned after I said all of that, and the 4 cops were looking pretty disapproving at them as well. I tell you, if you want to confront nasty parents like mine, do it in front of cops, because they'll probably not do anything dumb then. My mother just started crying and walking away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and Sil was off having a fit in my front lawn. Soon enough, they all lined up handing out boxes and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all was taken out pretty fast. But while doing it, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan several times, each time trying to offer more and more to try to make me change my mind. She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house, so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around, I didn't want his money, and I didn't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Sil ended up having another fit after hearing that and threw a box down, then sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. And she just sat looking angry sad there until everyone else was done. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. Before they left, I gave my parents a final earful about all of the crap they put me through growing up. And with 4 cops being right there, they couldn't do anything but stand there and listen for once. I exposed them to so many things that happened, and even pointed out how they couldn't just do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless, and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and Seal mock me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to evict me from my own house so Dan could stay in it for free. Yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to charge me more than I could afford just to park my camper when they knew I was out of the job. There were more very judgmental stares from the cops when I said all of that. So I challenged my parents one more time and asked them what I ever did other than being born to deserve to be treated so poorly. Because when I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to take it away from me for their favorite child, since they'd rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again, because clearly, I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there looking like fish out of water. So I kept ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father was beet red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time, and my mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she is a horrible person. They all are, and I bet they'll go to hell for it too. They were bad people, and they knew it. But if I'd called them out on all this stuff in private, instead of in public, they'd just get mad at me and still act like I'm in the wrong. They just maintained the denial for so long that it became a part of who they were. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me completely as they finished putting everything back in the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen. Not that I'd had a chance to get much furniture yet. They all got back in their vehicles, and SIL just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans of what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time. And while the family was somewhat divided before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. Nearly all of the family has sided with me after this incident. And those who haven't simply aren't siding with anyone. No matter how much my parents previously tried the "we did it for Dan" line, no one listened anymore. So any remaining familial support they had is now gone. Many in the family who I expected wouldn't side with me did. That includes the former flying monkeys. So I guess they've finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family next Christmas Eve in my new house. My parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on my brother's and Sil's profiles, surprisingly, and I saw Sil had her fourth baby in early November. They are still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because Esiel kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she can still guilt me. And I bet it's making my mother and father crazy, because they aren't getting any rest in their old age with 3 noisy, rude kids, a mentally unhinged SIL, my golden child brother, and a new baby in the house all at once. Maybe they could move into a camper in their backyard and let Dan have their house entirely. They might get some calm then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. Part 3. To those who kept saying that I should have just gotten my brother and Sil arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they are parents. Their kids need them. And if Dan was arrested, he'd probably lose his job. And without that, his family has no money. And SIL has a baby that's only a few months old right now. Neither of them needs to end up in jail. But you don't need jail for revenge. Police can help, yes, but I got payback without filing a police report. Would I be this merciful again? More than likely not, and they know it. I decided to wait on making an account and posting until after the new year, just in case more stuff happened. And it did. As previous readers know, my SIL was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were aimed at me. Especially after SEL had her 4th baby in November, she was posting the same boring nonsense over and over again. She just found semi-clever ways of rewording it, but she pretty much kept repeating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there wasn't enough space, she needed her own house, blah blah blah. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I have with these people, and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins in front of them too. They're just that bad. And since I waited until January to make an account, more happened just like I thought. I stated before that I'd invited half the family for a Christmas Eve party at my house, and everyone I invited all came, even though it was a fairly long drive of around 3 to 4 hours for them. But they wanted to come and show me their support. I was complimented by them a lot for how hard I'd worked to get a house on my own, and that they were sorry for everything I'd gone through. I was asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them, instead of living pretty much homeless for so long, and I had to sheepishly admit that I was very attached to living around here, and I had my best employment opportunities in this area. My hometown doesn't have a lot of great job opportunities in my field, if any at all. and I wanted to make my way as much as I could. An answer they overall accepted. We moved on to having a rather nice party, the best I'd been in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and I have to say, the one my uncle brought of Ray Charles was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else I've heard. It was a grand and happy time. I felt like for once I could just forget my past issues and enjoy the moment, but I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up. My parents, brother, and SIL popped in, trying to look all smiles. They didn't even knock, just walked right in my front door like they belonged there. I shut off the music and told them to leave immediately. They pleaded to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and yelled at them before I got another chance to speak. And he said, they don't deserve to be in my home or my life after what they tried to take away from me months ago. And he was backed up by several other relatives. Mind you, this guy is my mother's brother, and he loved her with all his heart until he discovered the truth about my relationship with my parents. My grandparents, as old as they are, quickly got in between us and said to my parents that if they want to make amends with me, it's far too soon, and they've never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They'd hidden their favoritism for my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was fooled anymore, and they needed to make a serious effort to try and treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and Sil and said they'd seen the repetitive nonsense Sil kept posting about. They're fed up with it, and to just drop it already. My house will not become their new home. Sil went back to her old routine of crying and had a pity party about how she should be the one living here, and not me. She flopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say, it wasn't fair I got this house to myself when I have no family of my own, and she has 4 kids that need more space, and she just wanted a better place to live in and feel like a real mom. It was petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she sucks as a mother because she lets my mother do most of the parenting while she sits on her butt all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money. And she has the nerve to complain about it. I even joked that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from her breast milk since she drinks so much booze, which I admit went a bit too far as I got some stares. And SIL demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I said the evidence speaks for itself. If she wanted to be able to afford to move out of my parents' house someday, then she needed to put her college degree to some use, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyway, so she'd have plenty of time after her baby gets a little older. My brother's eldest kid, who's 7 years old, ran up to start kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. And he kept at me about how his mom said that I was the bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here. That's when my brother grabbed his son to pull him away. But all the other relatives jumped back in, and this sort of turned into a family intervention against my SIL and brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, and her kids were crying. Hell, even Dan was very nearly in tears from the verbal lashing he was being attacked with. He ended up just sitting on the ottoman, I keep shoes in by the front door, and looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, he couldn't even say 2 words to me. Not with a whole house filled with angry people ready to judge him if he tried to let out his inner golden child again. If they weren't there to get in his way, I'd bet this would have ended up a repeat of when he tried to order me around to try and take my house months earlier. By this point, though, he'd been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation in the family was destroyed because the masks were all now off. Soon after, my parents, brother, and SIL all left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided speaking of what just happened for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night at my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper so there'd be enough space. I admit, it also makes a good guest house. My relatives all wanted a tour of it earlier as well, and they said they couldn't believe I'd been living in it for around 2 years. I got a lot of questions about it, like what summer and winter were like, and so on. I was up earlier than everyone else on Christmas morning and had a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen for those spiked eggnog hangovers a few of them had. I was complimented on being a way nicer host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, SIL did finally stop making posts that were obvious digs at me, and deleted all of the old ones as well. But shortly after the new year, she more recently made a new post complaining about how she'd tried to convince my parents to get a camper like I did, so it could be set up in the backyard so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their family home. Well, a taste of one's own medicine is never fun, because my parents turned that idea down. Vehemently, I hear. No one will push them out of their own home, let alone their master bedroom. SEL deleted her post after a few days. She hasn't posted much since then. She's a whiner. But if no one is listening, does a whiner still whine? I guess SEL figured out that it's useless to do it when no one cares. And Dan is stuck with his family here because he can't afford to move them out with his income. I bet they'll have another kid soon. I wouldn't be shocked. Things have been calm for me since then. I even had some friends over for a poker night. I'm terrible at poker because I can't remember anything about it, but who cares? We get to drink beer and munch on junk food while being silly fools. We stuffed ourselves with Whoppers from Burger King and had a blast the best way 4 grown men can when they just want to have some fun and get wasted. I think I might try to date someone around summer. I'm not getting any younger. I hope it goes well. My camper is just sitting in my yard now, and I confess, I sometimes went out there to hang out in it. I lived in it for 2 years. It's like my other home, and maybe someday I'll use it for camping like it's supposed to be. I've never been camping. My parents thought it was a waste of time, so it would be a new experience for me.